This slide presentation is on the basic format, how to design speeches for the extemporaneous style of speaking. When we talked about the extemporaneous style of speaking, we talk about a style in which you don't actually memorize your speeches, but at the same time, you don't write out your speeches. You do something in between. You know your speech well, you practice your speech, but you also have an outline that will help guide you through your speech, and this outline is called the basic format. Here's an overview of the basic format. We're going to we'll be going through every single category, but I just want you to notice right off the bat that it is designed to be set up in a way that your eye can follow it quickly. The three main parts, the introduction, the discussion, and the conclusion, are set up with Roman numerals, and then we have what's called the main parts, which are set up with capital letters. The reason for this is your eye will be able to pick out these things very quickly. Those of you who've taken English composition will recognize this in that it's very similar to an essay. Like an essay, there's a progression that you go through. And so let's go through each category and we can learn how to come up with a basic format. We start off with the introduction. And the introduction consists of two things, the attention getter and the preview. The goal of your attention getter is to engage your audience right at the start. You want to grab your audience's attention, hence the name, and there's different ways to achieve this. One way is to make a strong statement that grabs our attention. Another way is to have an interesting question that engages the audience. And a third way is a startling statistic or an interesting fact that once again engages us immediately. The example I'm going to be using throughout this presentation is an example of a demonstration speech, making pancakes from scratch. And here we have the attention getter. It is, does anyone here know how to make pancakes from scratch? Or do you just go right to the mix? So the first thing that happens is that a question is asked of the audience, and now you're the audience, if you're on the other end of this question, you're kind of forced to engage. You've been asked this question and you're thinking. We followed this up by saying if you do, you're not alone. According to Statistia.com, over 207 million Americans bought pancake or waffle mix in 2019. So that's an interesting statistic. It's got a lot of numbers in it, and it engages us. Now notice that this is written out from start to finish. This is the one place in your outline that we want you to write out your whole sentences, what you're going to say. And the reason for this is, what if your speech starts and for whatever reason you freeze? It doesn't happen very often, but let's just say for the sake of argument that it does. By looking down at your outline, your attention getter will be right there in front of you in its entirety, and you'll be able to get right back on track. But after this, think in terms of writing in bullet points. Think in terms of writing very short sentences that serve as reminders. Now, after the attention getter, your speech should not, whenever possible, have full sentences. Remember, the more you write, the more you will read, and we do not read our speeches in this class. This is very, very important. So the preview is simply the title of your speech. I might say, today I'm going to give you my recipe for how to make pancakes from scratch, but what I see on my outline is simply the title, How to Make Pancakes from Scratch, and that will get me off my outline and engaging with the audience. So now that we've gone through the introduction, let's move on to really the most important part of the speech, and that is the discussion. If this were an essay, we would call this the main body. But this is not a writing class, this is a speech class, and so we call this part the discussion. And this is where you, one, make your main points. You do this by listing these points in capital letters. Two, you arrange your main points in logical order. That will make your speech accessible and easy to follow for your audience. Remember, your speeches are never about you. They're always about your audience. And if you give a demonstration speech on a topic that you know everything about, your challenge is to dial it back a bit and make the speech in a logical order, because what are the chances that your audience knows nothing about it? There was a great movie called Philadelphia in which Denzel Washington played a lawyer who would always force people to interact with him this way.
All right, explain this to me like I'm a 2-year-old, okay? Because there's an element to this thing I just cannot get through my thick head.
In other words, when you explain something to a child, you have to be literal. You cannot take anything for granted. Denzel Washington is saying here, I want to be treated like a 2-year-old. This is the best way to get through to me. And this is really something that you should think about when you're doing your speech. You should always think about, how can I best communicate this with an audience? So don't take anything for granted when you're demonstrating something. Now, I talked about the demonstration speech of how to make pancakes from scratch, and what I've done here is I've come up with a strategy. I've broken down the process of making pancakes into 3 different categories. 1 is the ingredients, 2 is the preparation, and 3 is the cooking. So, I have the discussion, right? It's in bold letters, and then I have in capital letters A, ingredients, B, preparation, and C, cooking. We use capital letters when making main points, and we always indent to the right. Now, why do we indent to the right? It's because we read from left to right. So when you're giving your demonstration speech and you need to refer to your speech outline, all you do is you look down on your paper and your eyes very quickly look for discussion, and they find it because it's bolded. And then your eyes continue to read from left to right, and you find that part of the discussion that you want to refer to. And so this is all designed to make it easy for you to follow your outline. Now, I had put down ingredients, but there's a lot more to this than just ingredients. I don't want to have to memorize everything I have in my speech. I want to be given reminders. And so when things get complicated, we use subheaders. In this case, when I make pancakes from scratch, I separate out the wet ingredients from the dry ingredients. And first I make those 2 separately, right? So here I indented to the right and I put down a number, 1, and that's the first subheader. So you use numbers for the first subheader. Now, as you can see, I have yet another subheader. Very simple, it's nothing complicated. I indent to the right and I use lowercase letters. Now I have something that's very easy to follow. Here are the ingredients. Here are the wet ingredients for pancakes: 2 eggs, 1½ cups of whole milk, 1/2 cup of orange juice. For those of you who are saying right now, orange juice, try it. It's delicious. And finally, 2 tablespoons of canola oil. Notice that I keep indenting to the right. You're always indenting to the right because we always read from left to right. Now, I've talked about the wet ingredients, and I've also listed the dry ingredients as well. I didn't do it up above, but we'll assume I've already done that. And I'm going to move on to preparation. So I do a capital B, I bold it, and I do preparation. And then here's a very simple outline. Combine all wet ingredients. Combine all dry ingredients. Combine all. Okay, so that's very quick and that's very simple. But I want to make a quick point here. I want to tell my audience that when you combine everything, let it sit together for a few minutes, because that way the mixture kind of coagulates and it gets nice and thick. Instead of writing all that out or adding another point, I simply put things in a bracket and I go, let's sit for a few minutes. And what that means is I'm going to remind the audience why you let it sit for a few minutes. So you can do this instead of writing something out, as long as you, like I said, put it in brackets, bold it, put it in capital letters, and that way you won't forget it. So this is a very quick outline on the preparation, and that will bring us to cooking the pancakes. Now my first category here I put down is heating. Okay, so I've put this in 2 separate parts. If electric, I set it at 350 degrees, and if it's on the stovetop, then I set heat at medium high, and I put another bracket here, water trick to test heat. Now you may not know what I'm talking about, but that's okay. You're not giving the speech. This is a reminder to me. And when I say water trick, I say to my audience, it's important that your griddle or your stovetop be hot enough for your pancakes. And the way to test to see if they're hot enough is to run your fingers under water and then flip them on the stovetop or the griddle. And if they swirl around for a second and immediately evaporate, then it's ready. Okay, so I gave myself a reminder. Moving along, I add 1 or 2 tablespoons butter to skillet. Then I add 1/4 cup of pancake. Bubbles will surface up, and when they pop, flip your pancake. You heat it for 10 seconds, and then transfer it to the plate. So you can see I'm really not writing in complete sentences here. You can see that I'm writing very, very short sentences, and so this is something to keep in mind. We are not looking at a grammatically correct essay here. This is a speech. And that brings us through the discussion part, and now we come to the conclusion. The conclusion is the introduction, upside down. Remember that you start off with an attention getter, you have a preview. Well, with a conclusion, you have a review. Instead of the preview, you start with that, where you summarize the main ideas of your speech, and you do not have to review the whole speech. So don't think that you have to go through the whole speech. In this case, I would probably say, don't forget to add 1/2 cup of orange juice. It's really good. Remember to combine the wet and dry ingredients separately and then combine them as a whole. And finally, make sure that your griddle's nice and hot, and you do that by flicking water on it, and if it dances around and evaporates, you're fine. And after I go through the review, this brings us to the memorable statement. So remember that we started the speech with an attention getter, where we want to engage the audience. The memorable statement engages the audience, and you want to end on that same note of just as your audience is thinking about what you're saying at the start, you want them thinking at the end. Now, there's several ways to do this. One way is to make a link between your attention getter and your memorable statement. I wrote out here the cookie speech because years ago a young woman gave a speech on how to make cookies, and it was a traditional cookie recipe from her native country. But she told a story. She said that her grandmother had taught us this recipe. When she was a little girl, she made this recipe with her grandmother a lot. And her grandmother had died a few months ago, and she really missed her grandmother. So whenever she was thinking about her grandmother, she always made this recipe, and she was sharing it with us. Well, that got our attention immediately. I mean, we realized that this speech was not really about cookies, it was about a memory. And we all kind of sat up straight in our chairs because it's kind of a sign of respect. And the student gave the whole demonstration, went through everything. And then in her memorable statement, she said, so if you've lost someone you love, think about something you ate with them. Food could be a real comfort, and it's been a comfort to me since my grandmother died. So that was a wonderful way of linking the attention getter in the memorable statement. In the case of my speech about making pancakes, I would probably say, so now that you know how to make it from scratch, you'll be able to have great pancakes, and you'll never buy pancake mix again. And that's finishing number 2 on a fun, upbeat note, if that's the tone of your speech. Now, as we go along and you give speeches that are a little more complicated, and you want to make a point, finish on a note that gives your audience something to think about. So imagine your speech is over, you're returning to your seat. What do you want your audience thinking about? And that can be your memorable statement. The one thing I want to say here, it's really important to finish strong. All 3 main parts of your speech are important. The conclusion is the trap of every speech. The reason I say that is that after you've gone through your whole discussion, you're going to say to yourself, my God, I'm almost done with the speech. I've made it through the whole speech and it's almost over. And people tend to rush through the conclusion or don't even think of the conclusion. Don't fall into the trap. All 3 parts of your speech are important. The introduction, the discussion, and the conclusion. So please finish strong. So to review, the 3 parts of the speech are called the main points, and they are identified by Roman numerals. The main points as opposed to the main parts are identified by capital letters. Subheaders are very important. They simplify your speech. We use numbers for the first subheader, and we use lowercase letters for the next subheader. Always indent to the right because it makes your speech easy to follow. And there's one note here that I didn't put down, but double space. Keep everything far apart because that way your eye can just pick it up very easily. And this brings me to my last point. Why? Why do we do all this for our outlines? Why are we so specific? Well, the reason for this is because the basic format is there to help you, not stress you. Your basic format is your guide for your speech. It is also your reminder to make sure that you don't miss anything. For that reason, I want you to make up outlines that you are comfortable with. Only you will know how comfortable you are with your outlines. But if you're very comfortable with it, then practice with it in hand several times. Get familiar with it. Know it. And then, when you do your speech, use it. It will keep you on target, it will cut down on your anxiety, and most of all, it'll make sure that your whole speech will be delivered. This is what we'll be doing for the whole course. So please, get to know the basic format. Be sure to use it.